cultural psychology is just more of how do we explain, to put it really basically for your listeners, how do we explain the current disorienting time we're living through in terms of something, a framework, a conceptual background or backdrop that we can use to make sense of it. It's not disparaging femininity. Obviously, femininity is a good thing, but when it becomes disproportionately expressed in an institution, it becomes basically just entirely based on feelings, a lack of structure. And so when you have too much of it, it becomes toxic. Religion is important for its praxis. To me, its structure. I mean, think about it most basically like a church, the steeple, its order, its structure. And
symmetry.
Right. Mm-hmm. And it's scaffolding. And when a society loses that, there's no order. It's just chaos.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast. Today, my guest was PhD professor in psychology, JD Hartigan. You can find him on Twitter. That's where he's most active now. He's a developmental pathopsychology professor. He teaches statistics, and he's very interested in borderline personality and cluster B personality, and these are and on the macro scale, like on the societal scale of personality, and what these tendencies do to skew our society. It was very interesting to talk to him. We talked about child and caregiver interactions. We talked about cell phone use and depression and the kinds of psychological changes that come about from cell phone use. We talked about the universities and the state of the universities and the failure of the education system, differences between men and women. We talked about a number of different things. So I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did. It was very good to talk to him. So JD, let's start by you just tell my audience a little bit about the field of developmental psychopathology and measurement science.
Sure. So my background is in developmental psych, so looking at the development of children and adolescents across early infancy and adolescence, but of course, developmental psych spans the lifespan. So we look at longitudinal development across the life course. Developmental psychopathology is really just sort of a variant of developmental psych where we study sort of the unfolding of psychopathology or mental troubles, I guess is the best way to put it in layman's terms, across the lifespan. So psychopathology is sort of a big word, but it just really means the sort of manifestation of mental illness basically and disorders and so forth. So looking at how that unfolds across the lifespan. In particular, my focus is in the area of essentially, infancy to young adulthood is where I focus my area of investigation on. And then measurement science is really just sort of the quantitative, rigor that's involved in measuring mental illness symptoms, looking at statistical relations between, mental illness symptoms and what we think of as what might predict how mental illness unfolds. For example, early adversity, trauma. Most simply put, say, for example, we want to predict, depression from early abuse or something like that. That's just sort of a toy example that's just very basic. But measurement science is essentially just statistical rigor involved in how we measure and operationalize mental illness.
Right. So it wouldn't be, what I'm gathering from you is it wouldn't be advisable to make predictions on someone's behavior without measuring it, without scientific measurement, so that you can see what it's like across people and across different nationalities of people. There's lots of different ways that you can measure and make sure that these things are stable, these things that you find, right?
That's correct, and there's certain measures that we would consider to be, gold standard measures in the field that have been developed over time, and they've been validated, and they're reliable, which just means that they in fact, different, for example, different raters see the same thing when they're judging a behavior. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of ways to measure these constructs. The idea is to settle on one, to validate it, and to really understand its internal reliability, and therefore you have what would be considered a gold standard measure you can rely on. But people are developing measures all the time, and that's part of the process of accumulative science, of measurement science.
Hmm. So, in terms of infants, because this is from infants to young adulthood, that's your specialty. I was just speaking with some people about adoption earlier today, and sometimes, this is kids are adopted sometimes out of foster care,
Mhm.
and kids are put into foster care because their home life isn't sufficient for their well-being, and so they're taken out. Do you cover that population as well?
Sure. So a lot of the work that I have done, in terms of looking at the relationships of early care, has certainly looked into the adoption and orphanage studies of longitudinal development that look at how these orphans fare when they come out of Romanian orphanages would be the one that's the
Hmm.
most sort of studied example, and looking at how those orphans differ in brain development from those infants raised in stable homes, less traumatic homes. And myself, I didn't work in an orphanage, but I certainly worked in a residential care center prior to doing my doctorate degree. So I'm familiar with sort of the internal workings of the strengths and limitations of residential care and how those things operate. But certainly that literature, early adoption of infants and orphans, has played heavily into my work in terms of looking how attachment relationships across the early childhood period predict later stability in mental health, or later problems in mental health. So we call that adaptation or maladaptation. But I guess the Romanian orphanages would be the one that is sort of the big study. Charles Zena, Chuck Zena did a little bit of that. And so, yeah, absolutely.
There was a lot of neglect in the Romanian study, right? Because the kids were in institutional care and often left alone. Is that correct?
Well, I'd have to go back to the literature to review exactly some of the papers on it. But one thing that I know for sure is that there was a lot of instability in who the caregivers in orphanages were. So you have a lot of turnover, and therefore there's really no stable, reliable central figure that would figure into the infant's life, which is problematic from an attachment perspective. Is
Right.
there's no real bond to have there when you have multiple caregivers shuffling in and out, and then in the case where one stays for a little bit of time and then they leave, there's sort of that disruption, that break in the attachment relationship, which can be problematic too, at least in the acute term.
So when you say a little bit of time, what do you mean by that?
Well, let's say you have a caregiver in an orphanage who's there for a year, or enough time for the infant, or in the case of a young adult, a child, to establish some sort of working relationship with that caregiver, so that they are able to rely on them as a stable figure that is there. It depends. Certainly, the length of time is a little bit variable in terms of how long it would take to establish such a bond. But I would say off the cuff, just a year would be a sort of a barometer for stable, healthy relationship to kind of form. I know for myself, when I was working in residential, a minimum amount of time working with kids would have been about 6 months before you're really able to get them to even open up to you, much less trust you in certain, in a sort of deep way.
Right. And so if the caregivers are switched out before that time, then there's no time when those kids are going to feel confident.
Certainly, that's the likelihood. I mean,
Yeah.
certainly, there's exceptions to the rules always, but yes, as a general statement, for sure.
Hmm. Do you know that I'm sure you're very familiar with the still life experiments?
very familiar with the still life experiment. That methodology, that paradigm, the tronic face-to-face still face paradigm, has figured centrally in a lot of my work. I've used it. I've published on it,
Mm.
and so that's a great tool to simply document the effect of a lack of social interaction in the infant's world on how they respond. I mean, the still
How would
face.
you do that? How would you do that?
Well, in the still face, in the paradigm itself, for your listeners who may not be familiar, it's basically an early infant paradigm where you bring typically a mother and an infant into a chamber, a room, and you have the infant in a car seat and the mother, or in some cases the father, in front of them, and so they're interacting more or less kind of like you and I are right now, face to
Mm-hmm.
face is the point of it. And the protocol is simply this: typically the most basic protocols. You have 3 minutes where the parent engages in sort of facially games with the infant and sort of talks to them and coos to them. And then there's a 2 minute period where the caregiver is instructed to just maintain a still face. And then after that two minute period, they resume normal interaction. And one of the most robust, reliable effects is during that still face portion, the infant gets highly distressed, cries, and that lack of social engagement for the infant is just essentially, in a way, it just completely disrupts their social world. And so we see typically what's called in the literature the still face effect, and that is, during the still face, the infant cry faces, a lot of squirming, perhaps in the car seat, typically, which is what they're situated in. And then there's also the reunion effect, which we call, and essentially in that 3 minute post still face period, the infant is still upset, but eventually there's sort of what we would consider a rapprochement in the social engagement, in the sense that the infant essentially begins to settle once the parent resumes interaction. So, in terms of measurement science, getting back to the earlier topic we were discussing, the still face effect is a reliable effect. I mean, you see it in every paper that uses the paradigm. I mean, all the time when the social interaction has ceased, you see this uh, increase in negative affect from the infant. And when there isn't, or when there is some, let's say the infant isn't, highly negatively in terms of their distress, that
Mm-hmm.
might be a signal of some sort of suboptimal development. So that's one of the things we use it
Mm,
for.
interesting. Oh, I never thought of it that way. So, yeah, so maybe already they're not attached well?
That's one possibility. I know in the face-to-face still face paradigm, in my work, we use it with autism a lot. So,
Mm.
think of it from the perspective of an infant at high risk for autism. If social engagement is not as meaningful to them, and they're carrying sort of a genetic potential, propensity for potentially developing an ASD diagnosis, they may not respond
Mm.
as dramatically negatively to the lack of social interaction, because in the case of autism, it might not mean as much for them socially, or that might be one of their more prominent deficits. So we use that to kind of as sort of a preliminary window into potentially whether or not the infant might develop along the
Mm.
spectrum or develop a later ASD diagnosis.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's very interesting and something people could do if they were wondering about that. The other thing I'm thinking about, and I know this is a big part of it, is a cell phone use with infants. I've seen videos where a little kid will have his dad by the pool and the dad will have his phone and he'll grab the phone and throw it in the pool, and there's reason for it.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I'm very interested in exploring in the literature. No studies have kind of really
Mm.
looked at this, but during COVID, one of the things that they did was looking at the influence of COVID masks on
Oh,
infants. And
right.
so that there was a similar sort of idea that the mask might preclude the type of social interaction that was, optimal. And the cell phone is the same sort of example, where that, if the parent is distracted, especially in the infant's case, from interacting socially, that sort of distraction, that lack of time spent that would normally be socially engaging with the infant, could be, if you aggregate that over time, and your focus is distracted, that can become, obviously, to put it mildly, a very challenging experience for the infant to deal with.
And so, what kind of behavioral changes would you get if if people have different caregivers, or if they haven't had the interaction with the facial expressions and the communication with their caregiver that they need? What kind of behavioral changes would come about that would be negative, I guess?
Well, speaking generally, I mean, we would look for what we consider to be insecure patterns of attachment. So they might be a little bit more clingy or resistant to separation or reunion when the parent comes and goes. Um, there hasn't been really high quality longitudinal work kind of examining these questions, but typically, the idea is, when you generalize this into a hypothesis, is that, the more the parent is disengaged from the child, the more likelihood that the development is going to be impaired in some way in terms of the ability for the child to have healthy social and emotional development later in late childhood and early adolescence. And so there is some good evidence for that, and without wading into some more nuanced language that your audience wouldn't necessarily understand right off the bat, I mean, the point is that, one of the most basic ideas would be that, if the parent is not involved in the child's life, in the case of infancy, by socially engaging, that sets up a future where the child has no self-confidence in their own self-worth, and the working model the child has of themselves is one in which, there's no real stable sense of identity or agency. So you might have some depression symptomatology or other stuff like that. So that's the basic generalized idea of how early lack of attachment, patterns, secure ones, would negatively influence later personality and emotional development.
So let's move to adolescence. So in adolescence, if you see those kind of behaviors, the depression, um, the depressive type of behaviors that you were describing, we're seeing more of those kinds of behaviors now, are we not?
I would certainly say that we're seeing more, young adults having depressive-like symptoms, and that's different from a diagnosis per se, but certainly what we would consider to be internalizing symptomatology, and that really is just a broad term for sadness, despair, hopelessness, anxiety, uncertainty, unsettledness about their standing and about the future. And we're seeing that in particular tracking with, radical, liberal, progressive ideology. There's definitely been some work that has been done on that, and I've certainly featured that in some of my writing on my Substack and elsewhere. But we're definitely seeing that relationship. But more generally speaking, to your point, yes, young adults, especially millennials, I think that we're seeing a rise in these internalizing depressive symptoms, particularly in young adulthood, and really the idea, or what everybody's kind of talking about, is what explains that rise and why is that?
Yeah. And so, the, I guess, traditional way of raising a small child is that the mother would be at home, that there would be possibly more siblings around as well, and maybe even an extended family, which now we have nuclear families, or even less, we have single parents. Um, and often, if it's a single parent, then the single parent's very busy because you only have one income, and so that makes it trickier. I wonder if those kind of things, I imagine those kind of things are what you're looking at for
I
cause.
would say definitely the stress on parenting for sure. Whether or not the nuclear family versus a more extended family, I think that's an open question, something that could be interesting to look at. I know one of the things that I'm more interested in looking at, in addition to your point about single families, of course, is this idea of how increasing secularism and lack of religious institutions or small communities, and to your point about extended families, the sort of extended small community serves as an extended family, how that's impacting these the manifestation of sort of this despair and hopelessness that we're seeing, as well as some other stuff like increased cell phone usage and the sort of social media impact on all of this, and that's hard to really study rigorously. But I mean, just if you look around, wherever you go, and I see this daily, whether I'm working or just in my interactions that I have, walking around town, is that
Mhm.
everybody's looking at their phone, and that is such a dramatic difference from what we're used to, even 20 years ago, that there's no way there can't be some effect of that on development, especially for infants and young children and adolescents, because they're just not looking at each other's face really anymore.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
and so, really unpacking that and studying that in a rigorous way is challenging, but I think it's something that we have to look at, to understand what's happening.
How challenging is clinical? I know that it's challenging, but maybe you could explain to my guests just how challenging it is to do clinical studies.
Well, I think clinical studies and developmental studies are very challenging. And just for your guests, I'm not a clinician, so I don't see patients. I'm a research developmental psychologist, so I work hand in hand with clinicians to sort of formalize ideas they have based on their interactions with clients, and we, of course, work in a sort of synergistic way. But they're very, very hard because you have to establish, not only, as we mentioned earlier, how you're going to measure, for example, looking at your cell phone and how you're going to quantify that, but also how you're going to measure depression or how you're going to measure outcomes that we're interested in, like anxiety and so forth. And so you can use, typically clinicians will rely on, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the ICD, which is International Classification of Diseases. Those are typical disorder, classification systems. But in psychopathology research, we just used, self-report, parent report measures that are highly reliable. Like there's one called the Child Behavior Checklist, which we use for adolescents. And the adolescent can self-report, the parent can self-report, or you can have another informant like the teacher. And all three of those, which we call the self-report, the parent report, and the teacher report, they're the same item stems. They're asking about these symptoms, but they're highly reliable. And so that's a little bit more of a fine-grained way to measure these things than just using a crude diagnoses. So it's very challenging. In the case of social media use, one of the things that's very difficult is, how do you define social media? Do you define it as Facebook? Do you define it as TikTok? How immersive is it? How do you measure how frequently a child goes on, or adolescent clicks on social media? Those are things that are all very, very difficult.
Hmm. Yes, it's very challenging. So it's no wonder that with the rate of change now in our technology, it's no wonder that we are falling, maybe even falling behind in analyzing how these technologies are changing our relationships. And as you talked about religion uh, and the community of church that we historically have had for a very, very forever, for a very long time, and we have less of that now. Um, you know, and the Ten Commandments, that are central to the Bible anyway. Believe in God and serve your neighbor. And I wonder, that commandment, serve your neighbor. I I think people are less, if they're less attentive on themselves and more attentive on other people, then they're, and to see what changes they can make for good in their relationships, that's got to boost uh, your feelings and your emotions and make it easier for the day to go by. And I don't
Yeah.
see a lot of that. People are looking at their phones and they're inside themselves.
Well, I think the fundamental issue is that people are looking at their phones and they're, of course, socially interacting on their phones, but that medium of interacting in a human capacity on through a screen is not the same as it is in person. And that's a basic statement, I think nobody would disagree with, but yet how do we really kind of understand what that's doing? And I think the thing is that, when you're in, one of the things that I've studied in the face to face is you have much more than just facial interactions. You have kinesthetics going on. You have hands and gestures and body tonal movements, and you're not getting that on social media. And so, how does that impact one's ability to socially communicate is really an interesting question. I mean, obviously, one of the things that proponents of social media say is that you can have all these distinct niche groups where, let's say, a very unique group of depressed people can all meet each other online and they can affirm their feelings, but
Mm.
it's also disconnecting them from external reality in a way that you get into these social niche groups that are online only with fandoms basically, and you lose contact with the external world. So it just becomes an emotional resonance of their own feelings, and there's no sort of how do you judge them relative to the external environment. And that's kind of what you miss when you don't go, like you say, to your neighbor's house or yard, or interact on the street. When I was growing up, we had bikes and we rode around the neighborhood, and we were engaging with the external world. And so that's dramatically, in just 30 years time, changed intensely dramatically. And so how that's impacting later development is really a deep question, one that I'd love to study, but it's very difficult to do. And and a lot of what happens on social media and sort of more lay articles is people make these generalizations and they observe these patterns, but that's great, and I think that's compelling, but to do the work, to do the research, to answer these questions is very challenging.
Yes, and time consuming.
Absolutely, and it requires um, it requires money too. You have to get funding to do this kind of work, or at least some buy-in from some sort of institution to do it. But the institutions themselves have degraded their authority and credibility with the sort of the wokeness that we're going through. That it's difficult, very difficult.
So are you at a university?
Yeah, so I finished off. In fact, I was at the University of Toronto through last
Oh,
March, and then my appointment, concluded. But as I've spoken out, and this is something that I plan to tell, Jordan, when I have the opportunity to speak with him, perhaps, is that if you speak out, you're pretty much blackballed now from any academic setting that you could be in, and that's difficult for someone who wants to do the work and wants to do the research, because you can't get in and you're shut out. So the only recourse you have is to sort of leverage your ability to use social media, to use platforms like Substack to continue your work. And I've met great students in at the University of Toronto, many who reached out to me and who still want to work with me on an involuntary basis because they just want to do good work. And so it becomes very challenging and so forth. But unfortunately, you just have to kind of wade through the time and continue to speak what you believe is true, and hope that works in your favor long term.
well, just to speak briefly about Jordan, he misses his research terribly because he always had graduate students and was working with graduate students to think up ideas and then to test them out through research. But I think that the private investigations are growing. I know that he's working very hard on finding a way to continue his research without the institution. So you can talk to him about that and find out what's up with that. But I I do see and I do see, some of the people who he worked with at the university who are no longer who are graduated and not in the institution now are also available to do those types of research. So I think when you tell the truth and you find other like-minded people, there are many like-minded people, and it's not until you speak out, you think it's kind of a lonely place. But I think, don't you think once you speak out that there's more There's more cooperation.
Yeah, and I would say 100%. And I mean, I have even a tweet pinned to my Twitter feed, my X feed, from a student who reached out to me. And there's voices that will, you empower them by speaking out. And I missed my research dramatically too. And that's kind of one of the things that is really, I guess, challenging for me during this time is that, you spend all this time diligently preparing for your PhD, getting your PhD, doing postdocs, doing high quality work, and then you're kind of shut out because you have views that are, heterodox or different from the mainstream. And in my case, I'm a very outspoken person. I don't hesitate to say what I feel. I certainly, try to be respectful in all that I do and say. But I was an athlete, so I have that mentality a little bit that academia that's not very welcome to that right now, and I think that's unfortunately led to a lot of their degradation in terms of their credibility and authority. But I have millions of students, and I say that sort of obviously, generally, but many, many, many who have reached out to me on email saying that we appreciate what you say on X, we appreciate your work. And so there are people that want to do this work, and they will do it. And so 100% I agree that the challenge is just finding a way to create a new institution where we can leverage them and bring them together and be stimulated and challenged in those sorts of discussions that I too miss.
Yeah, well, it's hard to know whether the universities are going to need to crumble and begin again as something new, and it's kind of tricky to be in that time where seems to be what's happening.
Yeah, no, I certainly have gone back and forth on how black-pilled, so to speak, that I've been about that. And as we've gone on the last year or so, and with the obviously the Israel Hamas war, I've really become a little bit more disheartened about where the universities are, and I'm just trying to think through daily how can we build these new institutions? How can we put in place something that can be a new place for people to come and get educated? So I don't have the answer certainly, or else I would probably be in a better position right now than I am. But I'm thinking about these questions daily.
Yeah, I imagine you are, and many other academics would be in the same boat.
I know they are because they tell me every day.
Oh yeah, well, Jordan said that he has I think he calls them the dissident group, that he has people who either have been canceled or just find it difficult to work in the system anymore. And he said that that's growing exponentially, and so, who knows what that'll do? Because if there's enough people who are on the outside, now what is the inside composed of? If all the good people have left, what's left? So, we're in a very tricky time for the university as it is. And that's not just one or two, that's many universities.
Yeah, it's a pervasive issue across Canada and the U.S. and the West more generally, and I think there's a groundswell of dissidents, or just people who want to do good work and who aren't afraid of challenging each other's viewpoints or engaging in discourse. Ultimately, something new will emerge. It's just a question of how long that will take and what form it will have when it does emerge. And there'll be challenges along the way, but it'll be very instructive on how to handle those challenges and where they lead. And ultimately, those challenges will, provide the signature element of whatever these new institutions end up being.
As a psychologist, do you have theories on what happened to the university and why it's in such bad shape now?
My exploration in terms of that has led me to a lot more political ideology and sort of, the personality traits that's in particular the humanities and the social sciences tend to attract in general are more they're more agreeable. They're not as disagreeable. Their personality types are softer. They're not as stringent or again, disagreeable. I'm thinking in terms of the big five now, and Jordan would know this, but
Right.
also, the idea that especially the social sciences and the humanities have become utterly disproportionately feminized, and that has become a very deep problem. And I say feminized, not speaking directly aiming at women. Obviously, that will be a large portion of femininity, but also
Mhm.
men who are just feminized, and who, when you have basically all of the social sciences and the humanities becoming feminized, you end up with what I refer to as sort of a lack of structure, overly, everything is decided upon feelings rather than actual empirical truth.
Mhm.
And that goes too for, I know many of the great women that I've had the opportunity to work with in academia, whether that's in stats or my research, they were highly masculinized women. They were women, and they knew they were women, but they were very masculinized in the sense of they told you what they felt, and you knew it, and they instructed you well. But again, it gets back to the fact that everything has become, feelings, and this sort of wishy-washy,
Mhm.
waffling mentality where there's no authority. And you see the consequences play out now from that daily. I mean, you can look at all the demonstrations on campus where there's basically just romper rooms and no authority at all. And so I,
Sounds crazy.
it does, but I think over time that's what's happened. And even in developmental psych, which is my area, it's a field that, especially in infancy, it's you study infants, and that's obviously going to appeal more to females than it will males, just for evolutionary reasons. And so, one of the things that was always insightful for me looking back is that when I got into developmental psych, I was interested very much in just sort of the attachment theory, research, and I had to do as a research assistant. I ran subjects through the face to face or the strain situation procedure, which is another similar procedure, and I wasn't more of an infant feelings kind of guy, but you ran these infants through and the parents through, and you got used to that. But if that developmental psych becomes all women, you don't have any male influence there. So you don't have any. It just becomes. It can be problematic when all you have is just sort of women students or feminized students studying babies. You need to have an even mix, because structure is very important, and males typically will provide structure a little bit more.
And challenge. And challenge. Right?
Absolutely, and
Mhm.
we see the father influence more in adolescence when you have youth or children who grow up, and the male role of structuring and sports and rough and tumble play can come in. But even in developmental psych, when I look back, I went and was a hockey player in undergrad, and then I went into grad school, and there was no guys left anymore. It was just sort of me, and
Mhm.
I had to. It took a while for me to acclimate to that environment, because in the halls of academia, it's not in the locker room of a hockey team. So,
Mhm.
needless to say, it was a little bit more of a challenging time for me. And so, I think that is one of the things, as I look back, is an asset for me, is because I can understand the two worlds, and why there is sort of some of these problems now, having experienced both. And so we definitely need some more masculine influence, in particular in the social sciences and the humanities. It's not as deep a problem in sort of the more hardcore, rigorous mathematical or computer science fields, because naturally men gravitate towards them more than women do for obvious, again, evolutionary reasons. But
Mhm.
when you're studying mental health, it's a real problem.
So you know how kids are needing safe spaces now, and everything is about how they feel, like you said, how they feel. When kids are very young, when they're very young, the mother takes care of them at the beginning for the first couple of months anyway. And then when they start to move around, then fathers start to do rough and tumble play with them. And that makes them resilient. So do you think maybe I know that I've seen in my own marriage and in other families too, the father will try to play or discipline, and the mother will intercede because she feels that it's too rough or too decisive even. It's just and feel that their child is now in a situation that is not nurturing, I guess is what they must feel. Anyway, I wonder if those very early, and I've seen this with very, very young kids, and it just gets worse as the kids get older. And I wonder if that's what is making these kids unable to, because they kind of look like uncarved blocks kids who haven't been rough and tumble played with. They walk down the street and they're kind of lumbering, kind of not decisive looking integrated people. And I wonder if it's a lack of rough and tumble play by the father's interaction, like as a whole.
I think a lot of that speaks to just their lack of rough and tumble play, period. I know, infants and young children can get rough and tumble play from mothers as well as fathers, although typically the father will provide that. But now you have everybody on their phone. They stay inside. They don't go out, especially for young children. They're not riding bikes anymore and getting banged up on the street, or, they're on their phones, with the exception of perhaps those who are in athletics. But the normal neighborhood play is gone. And so they're not challenged, and they're not able to achieve any basic cognitive mastery of the environment when you're constantly on your phone. And so when you're on your phone, you're in sort of a pseudo world where you're not being impinged upon by the external environment. You're not navigating or developing any cognitive mastery of challenges that you might encounter in a normal situation when you're outside or when you're playing with a group of friends.
The kids, there's girls games and boys games, right? So there's like hopscotch, and we used to play 7-Up with a ball against the wall. And then there's these games that you play with girls that are clapping games that they play with each other. And those are all gone, huh? All those little, who knows what those were good for? They were good for something.
Well, recess in general, I don't even know what that looks like. When I was in grade school, we had recess. We played foursquare, kickball, jump rope. Even the girls' activity was very highly stimulating. It wasn't just, it was still rough and tumble in its own way. I know in my experience, we had foursquare, which would be, boys and girls, dodgeball. And so a lot of that is gone.
A lot of skipping.
Yeah, skipping. And all that's gone now. I don't know, to the extent, I haven't been on a grade school, setting, so I don't know particularly. I'm sure there's a lot of variation in how that's, gone on. But more generally, that's certainly declined.
Yes, well, after school, it doesn't seem to be happening. Even when my kids were young, and they're 30 now, those kids used to come into the house for dinner and then go back outside until it was dark, really, and then come in. And mothers had to be out there because they played on the street. So you had to say car, and then you'd say car, and then they'd move the hockey nets off the street. And every day those hockey nets were on the street.
Yeah, even growing up in the Washington, D.C. area, I had hockey nets. We played hockey down at we had a hockey rink, an outdoor sort of rink that got built. So, and I would play basketball. My neighbor had a little basketball hoop in his driveway, and we would go out there and do that. And, especially during the summer, there was a lot of that. So the effect of losing that culturally at such a large scale now, with everybody being more inclined to, especially the young generation, do less of that, I think we're seeing those effects. And so one of the things that I've often thought about as a way to, if you want to reduce reliance on young adults using their phones, you have to get them in some sort of athletic activity where they literally can't use a phone because they're playing a sport. And so I think athletics and environmental outdoor type stuff where you physically cannot hold a phone is going to be key to some of that. So outdoor adventures, I was in Boy Scouts, for example, fishing. Some of these more basic things, it's just a matter of a way of seeing if they can provide sort of the reinforcement to young adults to get them away from the phone, because the phone is
Yeah,
addictive.
it's addictive. Yeah, that's for sure for all of us.
Yes, absolutely.
Hmm. So tell me what cultural psychology is.
Cultural psychology, I think, is just explaining large term secular trends, as we've been talking about, in terms of psychological concepts and terminology. So it's much more of a study of the culture than it is of the individual. And I kind of have become more inclined to get interested in cultural psychology, in particular because of this challenging sort of disorienting period that we've been living through. And so a lot of my recent reading in the last 2 years has gone into scholars like Christopher Lasch and Philip Reeve, who have sort of drawn on the work of Freud and others, not as individual psychology, because obviously they weren't really scientists in the way that we appreciate psychological science now, but their insights were more at a cultural level. And so I'm reading now a chapter in a Christopher Lasch book that is just extremely insightful about how current political factions, we've lost all meaning of the left and right now.
Hmm.
But we have really sort of the right, the far right, center left, and maybe the radical, insane, progressive left. And Lasch has gone into detail from a book he wrote, in 19, I think it was 84, 87, about using Freud's ideas of the superego, the ego, and the id as sort of ways to understand these political ideologies now. And it makes such intuitive sense to me. I'm finishing up the chapter now, and I'm going to write an essay on it. But cultural psychology is just more of how do we explain, to put it really basically for your listeners, how do we explain the current disorienting time we're living through in terms of something, a framework, a conceptual background or backdrop that we can use to make sense of it.
Right. Which is a place to start, really.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, Winnicott's Donald Winnicott was a great object relations theorist, and his wife, one of his wives, his second wife, I believe, Claire Winnicott, made the statement: you have to have a central organizing theory or structure to grab a hold of to make sense of something. You have to have a starting place to grab onto to make sense of something. If you don't, you're not going to go anywhere. It's just going to be chaos all around.
Well, that's the same with defining what is ideal. Like a heterosexual marriage between a man and a woman that's family, that's child-centered, as being the center. And then you got to have the fringe, because people are going to change what it is that they are going to decide to do in life. But you got to have that center so you know how far you are away from something that is ideal. And we're not allowed, it seems these days, to be able to define an ideal. People don't want an ideal. And the ideal, of course, religiously is God. That's the ideal. And so, well, that's part of the problem, is it's multi-headed now.
Right, and that's the inherent weakness and sort of problem with this intersectionality. It's just basically you no longer have any shared common understanding or meaning when everything is just an identity avatar. And so that's what intersectionality does, is it just shreds into ribbons any common idea or common understanding of the world. And, in addition to the fact that it's, not methodologically rigorous at all, but it's just identity politics, and there's nothing shared anymore. And that's what we're seeing in culture. That's what we're seeing in academia. It's oppressor, oppressee. And even within the oppressed groups, you have 6,000 different variants of oppressed groups now, to put it sort of more generally. And so that's what it does, is it tears apart any common understanding for society to, have a shared purpose around.
Yes, and the more you define oppressor and oppressed, the more you bring in the slave and the tyrant.
That's
And
correct.
so you just leave yourself open to that, right?
Right. It creates antagonism, and basically it creates what I've kind of termed this macrosocial cluster B contagion. I mean, you have
Okay, let's talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a natural stepping point from what you mentioned. I mean, when you have all these different factions that are ribbons of some sort of common theme, the factions naturally will disagree and become antagonistic towards one another. It's just inevitable, and
Hmm.
that's a hallmark. The interpersonal relating between the groups becomes it becomes who has the power and who doesn't, who's more oppressed and who isn't. So it just lends itself to all the hallmarks of really a borderline relationship, a cluster B infused relationship where it's just fighting, antagonism, love, hate, emotions are dysregulated, and it becomes basically a disintegration of any healthy communicative ability between
Will you
between
define a cluster personality?
So cluster B personality is just a broad umbrella term to describe individuals who have borderline personality disorder or antisocial personality disorder, other disorders that fit within the cluster B umbrella. And so there's several of them, histrionic personality disorder. So a lot of the cluster B stuff is me speaking generally so your audience understands this. There's a lot of debate in the field about personality disorders now, how we measure them, how they should be quantified. But the bottom line is that there is a signature element to cluster B personalities, and you can't avoid it any way you operationalize these constructs. So you can see it through this disordered, antagonistic, um, petulant way of relating to each other, and that's really what intersectionality breeds. It's basically a fertile breeding ground for that kind of large scale way of relating amongst people and amongst groups. It's like the family who has everybody that's fighting with one another for some reason or another, and that's what intersectionality does. It creates that dynamic, not at an individual level, where a daughter is borderline with her mother or her father, but at a societal level, where everything has unspooled into this fighting amongst organizations, amongst groups, even within people and groups. It's just that's what it is.
There's no negotiation, it seems.
No, it's impossible because when everything's based on power or love hate or an inability to understand the other's perspective or an inability to regulate one's own emotions, it's impossible to do.
Hmm. Yes. Yes, this is a real central problem. And what do you think us not adhering to an ethical standard has to do with this problem?
Well, I think to understand the problem of this macrosocial cluster B contagion, you
Hmm.
have to understand there's this men and women track differently by the types of problems that they typically will demonstrate across the lifespan. Men typically have problems with aggression or antisocial personality disorder. They're more aggressive. Women tend to be more internalizing, more depressive. And these are just broad patterns that emerge across adolescence and young adulthood. And
Hmm.
it's not an indictment on either sex. It's just evolutionary. This is what happens at scale. And the cluster B stuff is just a sort of I see it as more of a secondary effect of the feminization of all of our institutions. Because when you have a disproportionate share of our institutions being heavily feminized, all of the mental uh, issues that track with females will then unspool and amplify within those types of settings because that's all there is. And so I see that as mainly the big part of the problem. But even within that, there's a lack of structure. You have feminized males who provide no structure, who provide no guidance and strong authority, a lack of authority. and that leads to a lack of any type of moral agency or moral authority or ethical system. So
Mm-hmm.
it gets down to a basic, simple point of structure. Men tend to structure. That's just inherent.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that women can't do that, but men at a aggregate level will demonstrate higher levels of that type of behavior, structuring, setting limits, defining terms. And so I see that as giving rise to a lot of this cluster B stuff that we're seeing. I mean, to give a really crude example, the Washington Post is an institution here in the States, a media institution that has seen dramatic loss of viewership and readership, and the whole media institution is basically in discredit now. And if you look at
Mm-hmm.
why that's happening, you can look to a lot of their employees and sort of their central, highly visible on social media columnists are basically highly dysregulated women, who have sort of impugned the credibility of that institution. And whether or not that's because they have a legit personality disorder, or whether or not there's just been a pooling of that type of individual within the institution, it's created absurd editorials, absurd social media presence, and the population is obviously responding to that, by leaving the Washington Post, by not subscribing, and by
Mm-hmm.
basically shaming it.
So when you say feminized, does that have to do with feminism?
In a way, it does, because feminism sort of rejects the patriarchal authority and the structure. But by feminized, I mean more of the femininity traits. And it's not disparaging femininity. Obviously, femininity is a good thing. But when it becomes disproportionately expressed in an institution, it becomes basically just entirely based on feelings, a lack of structure. And so when you have too much of it, it becomes toxic, and it
Right.
becomes dysregulating. And because it is inherently structureless. And so in reasonable doses, along with masculinity, it's a good thing. You need a balance of both. The problem is that our institutions have become disproportionately feminized,
Mm-hmm.
and there is no sort of balancing masculinizing force anymore. And
In the Bible, Adam names everything, right? He names the animals. He gives names to everything. Like you say, he gives structure. He
mhm.
gives order, and that's a male attribute for sure.
Yeah, and I
That
mean,
that needs to be understood like that for sure.
and I think, for your viewers, a way to understand this in a more academic way is, we know, for example, that autism is disproportionately expressed in males to a certain degree. We're not sure exactly how much, but the reason is, in autism, you're highly focused on structure and order and rules based systems of thinking. And that's just inherently because males track that way, the way their brains are hormonalized. And so, um, when you lack that, and it's overly feminized, it becomes completely structureless. There is no rules based systems of operation anymore. And what happens is it becomes, as I there's a great article written by a feminist author, the tyranny of structurelessness. And it's essentially what happens when you have no male structuring agent in it. It just becomes structurelessness, and everybody's just, there's no orienting, scaffolding to make sense of anything anymore, and everybody just ends up fighting and becoming petulant, and there's no stabilizing agent.
In it for themselves.
Right, because there is no uh, ethical system of rules that can demarcate what is ethical and what isn't.
Yeah. Right. Correct. Yeah. And I don't know what the proportion is of women to men in the universities now, but I know that there are more women than men. And to a point, once there aren't enough men there to be a presence on the campus that's reasonably balanced, and it might already be there. Do you think women will stop going to university?
I think what you'll see the more masculinized women who gravitate towards men type things or masculine things will leave the university, and they'll go to places like these new institutions that we talked about, where there's a sort of a demand for truth and a demand for rigorous investigations. You'll probably still see women going to the university who want to just study fine arts or arts or emotion based things, but anything to do with the ordering of the world or understanding, um, you know, rules based systems of how things operate in the universe will no longer be studied in the university, unless they can find a way to restabilize. And that's really the open question that we've kind of mentioned before. But
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of the undergraduate female students who work with me. They're very rules based thinkers, and they want to quantify data. They are highly proficient at statistics, or at least they can learn that type of thing quickly. And they want to engage in the discourse. They're not offended by things they might disagree with, and they're more rambunctious. They're more ready to play at the highest levels, in my view.
Mm-hmm. So, what do you think the universities have to do with mate choice? So, coming to university to find a husband or a wife.
I've never really contemplated that myself. I think that universities, maybe, just off the cuff and thinking about it, I know I had my first relational experiences in college,
Mm-hmm.
and it just organically happened. So I think allowing that to happen on campus is important, but that has to happen in the context of an environment where those things can happen, not some
Mm-hmm.
therapeuticized safe space where you can't engage in sort of those, um, you know, parties where things get a little out of hand and there's sort of some discomfort and awkwardness around how you relate to the other sex.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to the extent that those opportunities need to be there, the universities can't create some sort of therapeuticized bubble that don't allow for those types of things. That's not to say that anything goes. It never
Mm-hmm.
did anything go. There were still obviously rules that you had to, abide by, but the way things organically happen is the way that it should be. And I think if that is allowed to happen and allowed to exist, I think that will be a healthy way for going to undergrad for mate choice to be a potential reason to go to undergrad.
Well, I wonder, with men, um, there are men who have many mates at the university, and then there's some men that don't get any mates. But if there aren't enough men to be involved with as many women as there are there, I just wonder if the university will lose more people.
Yeah, I think
Because,
that's a good point. I mean, especially in the typical liberal arts colleges where that's a problem, that could be
mm-hmm,
a key thing. I never obviously went to undergrad thinking about mate choice per se. I was going to undergrad for as an athlete,
mm-hmm,
but I'm grateful that my undergrad allowed me. One of my first relationship with a young woman at undergrad was one of my most memorable, obviously, and so the opportunity to have those develop on undergrad campuses is extremely important. One of my roommates, a hockey teammate, he met his wife in undergrad, and they're
mm-hmm,
married, and we still keep in touch, and so that relationship was allowed to happen and allowed to unfold in the setting of a college campus. It wouldn't have probably they would have never met if they hadn't gone to the same
mm-hmm.
campus, most likely, even though they both came from the same area. But um, those are crucial developmental opportunities that have to be allowed to exist, and allowed to exist in their sort of more natural
Yeah.
state, not some sanitized version of, no touchy here, no feely there.
Right. Yes, that's for sure.
And in our legal Title IX world, there's it
Mm.
creates a problem because men are under attack, no doubt, for any type of awkward glance or what have you, and that becomes inherently, not a good thing for the allowance or the affordance of the development of those types of healthy relationships, because everything is then again toxic. It's toxic, and it creates artificial circumstances or environments where nothing can unfold naturally the way it used to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, my opinion is that if we don't come back, and I think there is a movement of men back to the church, and I think women will follow. And I think they have to follow. I think they have to follow because the way that things are going now, people aren't having relationships as often as they did. I think the Japanese men under 30 aren't having at 30 are 30% less of the men are having relationships at this point, or are virgins even.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so there's some really serious issues that are happening with our young adults. I'm wondering if girls should finish school earlier. Maybe at 16 or something, and then get their university degree so they're ready to be married at 20 instead of 22. Because if you have a baby between 20 and 25, you're pretty fertile. As you get towards 30, well, it goes down. And then when it gets to 40, it goes down even further. And the way that we're keeping women and men in school for so long, sometimes till they're practically 30, then a lot of the time that they would have had to figure out themselves is gone. And, I was ready to leave home when I was pretty young. And whoever I talk to says, yeah, they were ready to. So especially women, they grow up faster than men, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they could finish school earlier and go to university because they're more mature.
Yeah, I mean,
Anyway, it's a new idea of mine. I'm just throwing it out there.
I would see it more. I guess I would say I think they're maybe not encourage them to finish school earlier or fast track them onto having babies sooner, but less of an emphasis on prizing sort of this idea that for a woman to be successful, she has to be a girl boss or some CEO or what have you.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's just not true.
No, it's not true at all. And one of the things that I've experienced and seen firsthand is that confuses a lot of young women. I mean, and I'm just saying this
Mm-hmm.
more anecdotally from women that I've interacted with in the course of my travels, especially in settings, like the gym or what have you. They're just like they're not in touch with their instincts as much anymore because they're constantly being propagandized that they can't be in touch with their instincts, or if they are, there's something wrong with that.
Yeah,
Um,
that's so opposite. If you don't pay attention to your conscience and what seems right, then you're completely out of touch with
and
your
that's
highest values.
and that's not to say that some women may not want kids, and that's fine too, or
Right.
they may want to put it off for a while. That's fine too. But I think the majority in aggregate probably if sooner than later they'd be happier if they had them sooner than later, and not focused on being a girl boss or being some CEO of a corporation, which is you know at the highest levels, it's not where they track to begin with. And I say that in the sense of they're just women in general more agreeable. They don't necessarily display the dominance and disagreeableness that men do in the extremes, and so therefore, they're less likely to not only succeed in a high level, CEO type position, but they're less likely to enjoy it. I think over time, that's not for every single woman. Maybe some do, and I know many of the female academics that I've worked with are highly competitive. So there are exceptions to the rule, but when you're talking about societies, you're focused on the rule, not the exceptions, because a society has to be organized around the rules and the averages, not the extremes or the exceptions. Otherwise, everything becomes inverted, and it's becoming worse that now because the mainstream cultural institutions and academic institutions are trying to create an artificial pseudo reality based on the exceptions to the rule and not the
Yeah.
rule.
Yeah, that's for sure. And there are so many, there are as many exceptions as you can name, right? So then everybody's an individual. Everybody's isolated because everybody is an exception. If you don't have the majority um, as the most,
It's the common element as the common,
yeah,
you
and
know.
it has to mean the most. It has to be what you would strive for if
Right.
you could.
And that's what I call ideographic insanity or pluralistic fantasy. I mean, there's a
Mm,
threshold at which you can study individual stories. I mean, there's a threshold at which a society can be anchored around 1,000 different my truths. Or, pluralism is great in politics because you want diverse viewpoints, but there's a point at which that becomes untenable and intractable. And the same can be said about studying. A lot of personality psychologists, and Jordan would know this, they study this ideographic method, which is different from the nomothetic method, which is more folk wisdom, large categories, and naming categories, common binding folk wisdom concepts. But ideographic personality researchers study individuals and each individual as its own unique case. And it becomes completely useless for understanding rules and common themes that explain the universe when you do that.
why
And
do they study them like that
I
then?
think because it's more of a feelings-based way of looking at each
Oh, I
individual.
see.
So in other words, when you're studying a clinical patient, or clinicians focus on caring more, they focus on understanding every nuance about their patient. And in the case of personality researchers who study, for example, borderline personality, it's like each individual is their own unique case, and therefore, when you do that, borderline personality disorder for idiographic researchers can become. They want to abolish the concept, the nomothetic concept of BPD, because it doesn't fit exactly each one of their cases. And that's one of the things in philosophical psychiatry that's unspooling, is sort of this idea of getting rid of these classification systems because they constrain explaining everybody's unique truth. And so I think that's
Mm,
where a lot of these things end up, is just ideographic insanity or pluralistic fantasy, because you have too much of it and there's nothing common anymore. There's nothing that explains the world, much less binds a common population.
yeah, it's postmodernism gone mad. Huh?
Correct. Gone amok, run amok completely.
The first time that I didn't pay much attention to postmodernism for a very long time, but when I did, and someone explained it to me, it made me feel really kind of sick to my stomach because I felt like I was unmoored. I wasn't standing solidly on the earth with those kinds of with that kind of concept of everything being equal, and nothing being, there no guiding light, no point of interest. I mean, these things. If you think that no point of interest, then what do you have if there's no point of interest?
It's
You have no aim. You have no aim at all.
Yeah, it's structuralessness. It's just disconnected from evolutionary biology. It's disconnected from empirical reality, and there's nothing that anchors within it. Everything is seen about some evil social force that is guiding who has power and who doesn't. So
Right.
it's completely a socially determined system of a conceptual framework to understand the world, disconnected from our evolutionary biological instincts, origins, and development.
Yeah. So politics gone has taken over everything.
It has, and that's really something that's new to me, because I tell friends of mine who wonder about what happened to me after I did my PhD. Science has become politicized, so there's no way to avoid it anymore, and because of that, that's part of the reason I have to be on social media, because everything is politicized. So if you're not on the platforms where you can push back, you're at a disadvantage. And so fighting the political wars or the culture wars is a new thing, but it's inextricably tied to good science now. And so I don't know how any other way to really be a steward of science and research aside from wading in to the culture wars.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like the dark web has come into what was the dark web. And I don't know anything about the dark web except for it looks to me like pirates on the high seas. Um, Now that sounds like, I wonder if the dark web has come into the mainstream, and now we're unmoored because there isn't a lot of there's no order, like you said, there's no structure.
Well, one thing about in the internet, I mean, forget social media for a minute, but the internet has created an environment where the institutions no longer have compelling authority anymore, because anybody can speak out on the internet. Anybody can seek their own truth
Mm-hmm.
on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't really recognize how much the internet has changed, old types of industrial authority, when you had newspapers and so forth that were sort of the guiding sources of authority about events in the world. With the internet, anybody can find information they want to sort of confirm their beliefs. And so it's all the more reason that the institutions don't discredit themselves, because if they do, then the internet becomes everyone's last refuge. And that's kind of basically what Twitter is now. And so
Mm-hmm.
everyone, to put this broadly for your viewers, why is Twitter, for example, why is Facebook so addictive, or why are people there? There has to be a motivating reason for them to be there. They're not there just to be there. They're there because nobody can make sense of the world anymore. And that's the only place they can go to either find their niche group or to engage in that discourse. So it's addictive because everyone is confused. And so when you're confused, you're looking for some way to anchor something. And that's why they're there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know that I've replaced a lot of what's on my social media with religion.
Well, and that's part of why religion is so important to society. I grew up Catholic, but I would consider myself, I guess you could say an agnostic. I don't know how Dawkins would classify me per se, but religion is important for its praxis to me, its structure. I mean, think about it most basically like a church, the steeple, its order, its structure. And
Symmetry.
right,
Mm-hmm.
and it's scaffolding. And when a society loses that, there's no order. It's just chaos. And so
Mm-hmm.
you the reason you have cultural traditions and religious traditions is because the masses have created them as a way to order their society. And religion, sort of the metaphysical part of it, is what anchored them to allow them to do that. When you have societies that no longer feel the need to believe in that metaphysical aspect, they also want to dispense with the cultural elements, and that becomes completely disorienting when you do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see religion much more important for its structural value than it is for its metaphysical value. But in terms of the masses that believe, you're never going to get them to understand that. It's just not possible. They obviously believe in the faith-based eternal everlasting life, or whatever the particular religion is in terms of its metaphysical component. But that's not what anchors the cultures and the lived world. It's the structural aspect, the praxis that is important.
Well, I think what's important, at least for myself, is to be guided by God's will every day, which gives me structure.
Mm-hmm.
What decisions I make about the next right thing are guided by my conscience, and I don't get my guidance from what I hear people say, really. unless it makes sense.
No, and I can see for many, I think that's absolutely part of the appeal. For me, I get the structure from just my understanding of science and
Mhm.
empiricism. I don't need to feel the belief of some higher authority commanding me. I mean, my conscience is my conscience. I like to refer to the gym as sort of my church or my temple, because it's like that's the structure. That's you're engaging in lifting weights or doing something physical that you don't need a lot of someone to tell you is good or not. But for others, having that source of authority that guides them, that provides them that organization to live out their life, that's crucial. And that's also what cultural traditions do. However a culture practices them, that unites them, that binds them, that provides them organizations and organization in an otherwise chaotic world.
Well, the one thing I would say is that the truth is the guiding light of science, and truth is also an ethical endeavor. So I don't think they're at odds with one another. I think they help one another be more true.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that I haven't explored as much, as sort of that intersection between truth in terms of its ethical, moral foundations, and truth in terms of numbers and quantifying and simply mathematical operationalizing certain constructs. But there's certainly that tension that is good to have that discourse with, because truth is definitely there's qualitative truth and there's quantitative truth, and I think in between those two, there probably is a common truth that is sort of superordinate above them.
Right. But yeah, truth in science is without truth, there's no science, right?
Correct. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So definitely, we need truth. So can you see anywhere where your work is bringing about positive change in society?
Well, I think for right now, because I'm not in a situation of institutional support, the only positive change I can see is speaking out, is empowering other people to also speak out and push back against what we're dealing with in terms of the ideological capture of the institutions and sort of um, what's happening there. So I see my work as, right now, that's the important feature of it, is getting others to have the courage to speak out, or to join forces, or to work with one another to correct the problems that we see in the academy.
Well, my husband told me about you because you speak out, because you have um, you have the it's not exactly bravery, but it's you have the forbearance to just say what you think, and that's well, it's necessary.
It is, and I'm fortunate to be at least in a situation where I can pull that off. I don't have to depend on the institutions for support right now, but it's very disorienting not to be in one, for the same reasons that you mentioned. Jordan feels like he misses his research.
Hmm.
But I don't see any other way. Like, you get to a point where you're so suffocated by what's happening that the only way to breathe is to speak out. And that's kind of, I guess, what my personality type is. I can't, I sleep well at night because I'm able to speak out. If I wasn't, or I was muzzling myself, or not able to be as rambunctious on X, I don't think I would be as mentally, at least what I believe to be mentally healthy, as I am. I know others who don't speak out and they just go along, and they're 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 not, they're like you say, they're not active, they're not happy, they're not buoyant, they don't have that zest that you think people that would be healthy have.
Hmm.
So I'm grateful that I'm able to do this, but on the other hand, it can be challenging. It can be hard when you're not in that institution, and you have to. Right now I'm working basically at a deli just to get extra income, and while that's great, and I'm able to work in a different environment, it's also I'm finding it very challenging in different ways because I can't, when you're at a deli and you're serving customers, you're not able to be in that discourse. You're not able to be engaging real time intellectually. I mean, there's customers that come in, you can have great conversation, but it's really trying to find that balance. And for my personality type, it becomes very difficult.
If you could teach any course that you wanted to, what would you teach?
I would probably teach, obviously a course in, well, three courses that come to mind right off the bat. One in attachment theory, one in statistics, which I'm actually teaching in the fall, as a matter of fact, but also a third one around cultural psychology, what we talked about earlier about, Freud is dismissed in some cases, rightfully so, by pretty much everybody in psychology, that studies psychological science in the sense of, but his work is still very insightful and brilliant at a cultural psychology level, as well as others like Donald Winnicott or some of the other psychoanalytic theorizers. And so, Kernberg's work on malignant narcissism also fits in well to explain what's happening in the culture. So a course like that, I don't know what I would call it, maybe cultural psychology revisited or cultural psychology for the new age. But that would be a rich course, I think, for students to really take in and consider. And so those are the three courses that would come to mind.
So you talk about emotional dysregulation. Do you mean borderline cluster B type?
Yeah, that's
problem?
essentially what emotional dysregulation would be. It's just a higher order constellation or aggregation of things like depression, anxiety, neuroticism. Emotional dysregulation more broadly as sort of a general way of thinking. It's just the inability to regulate your emotions. It's just complete disintegration of any ability to regulate your feelings in a way that becomes, it's basically like what happens with the infant and the still face. They become emotionally dysregulated. They become highly negative, crying, squirming. That's basically emotional dysregulation in infancy. Scale that to young adulthood, and the phenotype is then borderline personality disorder.
So birth control pill, do you know any research on, because I'm curious about, when I took the birth control pill when I was young, and it was not good for me. It it made me depressed, and it also gave me a feeling of I didn't have any self-preservation. I was willing to put myself on the line for like anything. It wasn't even important things, but I would, and I see that in young women now. I see that where they are acting out and not taking care of themselves in a gentle manner, or even in a careful manner to preserve themselves. They're putting themselves out on the line, like these protesters that are on the universities now. They're very vile. They're quite vile in their communication with people who come up to them. And I wonder how much the birth control pill has to do with it.
I really couldn't speak to that, as I don't know any of the research on that. I would surmise. I mean, again, I'd rather not. Really,
you don't know.
Yeah.
That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. But yeah, I took it. I took the birth control pill when I was younger and went off of it when I was older. And then after I had kids for about maybe 3 months, I took it, and it completely changed my personality again, like completely.
I mean, the only anecdotal experience that I can mention is, I mean, I know that, I've had girlfriends that have been on. I haven't really, reflecting back, I don't recall any weird changes per se, but, I don't, it's been, who knows what the pills now contain or don't contain. And
right.
It's hard to know.
Yeah. Well, I know that women on the pill choose different kinds of men, right? They choose more friend associations than masculine men. And that might have something to do with the feminization of men, because women are the choosers, right? They choose their mates. And if women are choosing more feminized men, I wonder if that's feminizing men. Anyway, so
Certainly interesting hypothesis to potentially be looked into.
yes, that's for sure. I think it is. So what do you think about our education systems? And we have from K to 12, the ideologies have really taken over the education systems. And in terms of kids and their engagement in life, do you think that the education systems are doing more harm than good?
Yeah, I would say what's happening now in the K through 8, K through 12 systems is just what's happening in the academy, but it's almost even worse because it's gender ideology and CRT, critical race theory, and it's basically intersectionality on steroids. So it's a negative environment for children to learn in.
What
Again,
would you suggest they do instead?
instead of going to grade school,
Yeah.
well, ideally you correct the grade school, but I don't know if that's possible. I would say, um, the parents become a crucially important role there to provide what they're not getting in grade school at home, either through homeschooling or in a supplement to what they're getting in grade school. I mean, certainly there's some grade schools that are doing better than others.
Right.
I know Catholic schools have sort of been able to withstand some of this encroach of ideological capture better than others,
Hmm.
and other
Hmm.
schools as well. But supplementing children's understanding of the world with whatever they're getting in their K through 8, K through 12 system, and challenging or outright calling out some of the lunacy around gender ideology and CRT.
Right. So getting involved maybe in the schools
Yeah,
as much as
yeah,
possible.
yeah, 100%. I think we saw that a little bit through the pandemic with the masking and stuff like that, but definitely getting involved more.
Yeah. Well, what I've found with parents getting involved is if they get involved and they find out what's there, often
Animated to change.
they want to get their kids out of there.
Yep.
But not always. Not always. I imagine there are still some schools that are left, but I haven't seen them recently. That's for sure. So I just have one final question. We could close on this. If you had a chance to usher in one major improvement within your industry or instigate a major shift in approach, what would that be?
Well, I guess my industry is higher education, a research academic. And so ushering a change, I would say, to put it broadly, to get back to what science is, to get rid of to expunge the ideological capture of the academy, especially the social sciences and the humanities, and to get back to science as it should be practiced. And what that means is just, again, providing um, moral and academic authority and into a field, into a like the social sciences and the humanities that has lost any of it, and that change has to be ushered in through a disciplined strategy of constant messaging, creating a cultural footprint, essentially what Jordan is doing, and assisting in that effort, um, but also assisting in that effort in a way that walks the fine line between utilizing shame as it should be used to shame some of what's happened and some of the ideological capture that's taken over, but also not to alienate people who are a little bit more thin skinned, who could be persuaded to understand the deep problems and the deep rot, but that would otherwise I'd be radicalized in the other way if they perceive you as attacking them relentlessly. And so finding that balance is crucial. I think you need both. I know for me, I was, again, an athlete all my life. I have that locker room mentality. I expressed that on X intentionally. but it's also come at some cost to me because the institutions still want to retain this patina of nicety that is inherently sick right now, because it's nicety without any counter
It's
to
a
it.
lie.
It's a lie. It's a weaponization of empathy is what it is, and
Hmm.
it's a
Hmm.
lie. It's a moralized lie, which is even worse than a flat out lie, and it needs to be exposed as such. So that's the change that I would like to see ushered in, but it's only going to be ushered in by me encountering a lot of hate, a lot of smearing, a lot of disappointment.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I don't know if you can go back to the university or if you have to set up something new.
I don't know either. I'm in that transitional space now where I don't think I can be in a sort of I mean, I was trained as an academic, right? So one of the hardest
Hmm.
things about working at the deli is that it doesn't draw on those skills really much at all. And that's just, it puts me in a mind state that I don't like to be in per se. I mean, I can tolerate it in small doses, and it's good in small doses because it exposes you to a working class world who
Hmm.
operate completely differently in many ways. It's so dramatic to change. So I see that, and I grew up with that mentality. But now, all I want to do is just engage in this battle on X and write and communicate my ideas and uh, learn statistics and teach statistics and get better at statistics. So I'm driven in that way, and I can't do that anymore in the institutions. And so it's a drain. Even trying to apply for institutional positions now is a drain because you're just
Hmm.
engaging in a worthless endeavor. And so
Unbelievable.
that's the change that I would like to see ushered in, and I'm fortunate that yourself and Jordan and others have found me, and that's been a source of inspiration for me.
Yes. Well, I'm sure that doing these podcasts, especially the one with Jordan, will also bring you change for the better.
I hope so, definitely, absolutely.
Well, I hope for that. That's for sure. Thank you very much for coming on my podcast. I've been waiting for this for a while, and I don't know. I live with a scientist, so I like talking to someone who's thinking this way and dealing with these difficult problems.
Well, I would love to hear when the time is right what Jordan thought of our discussion, and
Hmm.
I'm grateful again for this opportunity. I've been looking forward to it for a long time too, and it's great to be in the presence of others who understand what we're living through.
Thank you.